Now let me welcome our next speaker, Dr. Peña Jorge, who is also my colleague from the Department of Communication at UC Davis. Dr. Peña is currently an assistant professor in the communication department, but will very soon become an associate professor, just like Amber. I counted the days for you, 2 months, 6 days. Congratulations. Dr. Peña's research examines the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral foundations of computer-mediated interactions. His most recent work looks at priming and cognitive load effects in video games and other virtual settings. The title of his talk today is The Virtual Self, How Video Games and Virtual Experiences Change People's Behavior. Now welcome, Dr. Peña.
Working? Okay. Hi, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I'm going to make a little bit of a fool of myself today, I believe, because I'm going to ask a kind of trivial question perhaps to an academic audience, but nonetheless the question stands. And that question is connected to whether virtual experiences matter, or are people just wasting their time as they play video games or interact in virtual environments? Now, when we think deeply about that question, we can think that perhaps that question is not that outlandish. For example, there's an ongoing debate nowadays in terms of whether playing violent video games would get people to be more aggressive out there in the real world. So, for example, I have examples here of video games that are off the shelf, available, that you can go home and play if you have the time, of course, and you can see a huge amount of violence happening in these video games. The question right there still stands. Does playing aggressive video games get people to be more aggressive out there in the real world? There's also some interesting research out there that would show that our cognitive abilities are also perhaps affected by playing video games. For example, the work of Daphne Bavelier would show that if you get students to play action video games like Call of Duty or shooter games, and you compare that to students that were pre-tested in terms of their cognitive abilities, but actually played a different type of games, like, for example, The Sims, that you would see over time an increase in the development of their cognitive skills. For example, participants that played these shooter games were more able to recognize the color gray. Now, that sounds like something not very exciting, but if you drive around the fog, which we do here in Davis, or you ride your bike in the fog, then probably gray recognition is actually that you care for. Also, that over time, the participants would get better at finding information visually and would perform better at mental rotation tests over time as they played more action video games as well. Finally, a third manifestation, if you will, of this particular question of whether virtual experiences matter is very much associated to current work in the area of education. Can we get people to learn something meaningful when they play video games? There's some dramatic examples out there in the literature. For example, the work of Art Grazer at the University of Memphis would imply that, for example, if you get minority learners to have a virtual tutor that it's also represented with an avatar that looks like a minority, the same as the learners, that learners would like that virtual tutor more. But that minority learners show increased learning gains when the tutor is actually Caucasian. Kind of interesting. Or, for example, recent studies by Girard and Associates would show that if you get people to crush cigarettes in a virtual environment, and these are participants that were actually smokers, you would see significant reductions in smoking rates among smokers that crush cigarettes in a virtual environment. So this all to argue that perhaps virtual experiences matter, and perhaps this could be an exciting field of research in the future. Now, that being said, this is an audience of, I would assume, mostly social scientists, and some of our traditional research values still matter in this brave new world when we play with video games and virtual environments. It's just like, for example, the validity of our research, both the internal and external validity of our work still matter, even though we're at this new frontier in terms of the technology that people employ for educational or recreational purposes. There's also the question of whether the findings that I just showed you actually replicate. If we were to run some of these studies that I just showed you, would we find the same results, or was it just a flash in the pan? And there's, of course, the question of social impact of this type of research. It is very nice to test some of our theories and to show that our measures are reliable, but does our research actually contribute in a meaningful way to society overall? A few examples of these issues can be of validity and replication can be applied to the context of video games. Talking again about this idea of people playing violent video games and then becoming more aggressive, there's an ongoing issue of internal validity in some of these studies because the participants that would come to our laboratories would play video games for about 15 minutes, and there's an ongoing question of whether some of our outcome measures are really capturing arousal in terms of playing some of these exciting video games with the latest graphs and very involving sounds, or is it that people are showing frustration with the technology because, you know, it takes a little while for people to learn the controllers and actually learn to play a video game. So there's an ongoing question of whether our short-term experiments are actually measuring what they are actually supposed to measure. In terms of questions of external validity, there's still an ongoing question of whether aggression in video games actually translates to aggression in the real world. For example, a number of studies that are meta-analysis, so they would pile on study after study after study to see what's the general trend, would show some support for the idea that playing violent video games can get people to become more aggressive out there in the real world. But at the same time, there's some studies that would contradict this particular trend. For example, the work of Christopher Ferguson would imply that if you take a look at this particular graph and we see, for example, the adoption of video games over the years from the year 1996, we see a sustained increase in terms of the adoption of video games. But at the same time, even though we place much attention to some of the things that happened out there in terms of, you know, school shootings and the perceived role in video games on that particular regard, we also see that violence in the United States has been decreasing over the years. So you see that these two trends in terms of people playing video games and aggression do not seem to correlate, which would question the assumption that violent video games would get people to become more aggressive. I'm not trying to be cavalier here. I understand that many of these events in the media do capture our attention and our imagination, but the numbers don't seem to support that claim that violent video games get society to become more aggressive. There's also the issue of replication of some of these studies. For example, in fields like, for example, social psychology, the idea that priming effects occur has been contested in the past few years, and that is particularly important for me because many times I'm interested in getting people to be in a virtual environment and become someone else, and I'm assuming that being exposed to particular visual appearance of your own avatar would activate certain connections, so it wouldn't be outlandish to think that if I were to put you in a virtual environment and make you an older person in that virtual environment, that perhaps you would walk more slowly in comparison to yourself being a young person in the virtual environment, or so priming effects research would have us believe. At the same time, we know that there's some ongoing questions about whether this idea of priming effects actually apply out there in the real world. For example, some studies trying to replicate this idea of being exposed to concepts connected to older people, where that has a meaningful effect in people's walking speed. So as I said, this idea of priming is particularly important in the context of video games. People are exposed to virtual environments that should remind you perhaps of something that you've seen in the past, or your avatar should remind you perhaps of roles and people that you've seen in the past, and the people that you interact in virtual environments should carry the same social weight. We walk into these virtual environments with our old brains, with the things that we've learned offline. It is also important to realize that in many of these studies that I'm going to talk about, our participants are exposed to avatars that look in a particular way, and some of you might be wondering, well, you get people to be dressed up in this virtual Halloween party in virtual environments. I'm pretty smart, so I probably can see through your manipulations. Maybe this is not a priming effect. Here, I need to make an important theoretical distinction. The studies that I'm going to talk about today are connected to the idea of supraliminal, not necessarily subliminal priming. Subliminal priming is associated to the idea that you were exposed to information, but it was exposed to you so fast that you may not necessarily remember what that information was about. In the context of supraliminal priming, you might remember that you were exposed to an avatar or a virtual environment that looks in a certain way, but here we're interested in people not making a connection between exposure to something in a virtual environment and subsequent effects. For example, in one of our recent studies, we got people to come to a virtual environment, and these were all young college-age participants. What we did here is to randomly assign them to elderly avatars, right here, and younger avatars right over here. We pre-tested the avatars. I will take any questions that you may have about the pre-test and what was the difference between the avatars. They were just different in terms of age. So if I may move on. We also measured whether our participants were more discriminating in terms of age. We measured whether our participants were more ageist in terms of their beliefs to see whether the experience of embodying an older avatar in a virtual environment would operate differently depending on your own pre-existing beliefs about older people. Have you guys been to Barnes & Noble recently or any bookstore? We're academics, so probably yes. What we have here is that we invited our participants to take a walk around our virtual store and see the products that we had in that particular virtual environment. So after taking a walk around the environment, you will be exposed to all of these products, and then you would ask to make a choice of what magazine you would actually buy. And also we asked our participants whether they would volunteer to sign up on a Facebook page associated to some of the products that were exposed in the virtual environment. I'm very happy to report today some findings that for me are maybe quite interesting. The fact that we were able to replicate the elderly priming effect in a virtual environment. Now, there's some differences here. Our participants indeed walked more slowly around the virtual environment when they were embodied in an older avatar in comparison to when they were using a young avatar. Now, that being said, this is the movement of the avatars in the virtual environments. This is a little bit different from the previous studies in which they were measuring people moving in the real world, but I still believe that this shows a conceptual replication of the elderly priming effect in a virtual environment. But what about the products that people were exposed to? These graphs would show the choices that people made. We basically had the same type of magazines by the end of the virtual environment. So the same magazines that was framed as restful getaways or adventure getaways. And when our participants were using older avatars, they tended to prefer the restful getaways magazine in comparison to the adventure getaway magazine. And when they were using young avatars, that trend was actually reversed. So product choice was affected more by people's temporary virtual self than the real self, which I think is quite interesting. In addition to this, we ask our participants to come visit this website in connection to donating time and money in this, to this organization that was connected to the elderly. And our participants showed an increased intention to befriend the Facebook site to donate about $1.50 more to that particular charity and to volunteer about an hour and a fraction more on a weekly basis when they were embodied using elderly avatars in comparison to young avatars. I'm using this to show that virtual experiences may matter. But we walk to virtual environments with certain knowledge, certain frames, certain stereotypes, certain beliefs. The following graph might be a little bit more complex. All I'm trying to illustrate here is that our participants were more affected by the experience of being embodied in a virtual environment using an elderly avatar when they were less ageist. They were more willing to befriend the Facebook nonprofit, donate more dollars, and volunteer more hours when they use older avatars, and our participants were not into discriminating people based on their age. Thus showing that it's a little bit of a person by situation interaction. We walk into virtual environments with our old beliefs, with our old brains. Do you guys know about Nintendo consoles? Maybe you've been at a party and you played with the Nintendo Wii. Maybe you played virtual tennis, or maybe you played virtual bowling or something like that, or maybe never. Maybe you saw your kids or your friends do that. There's an ongoing question on how we can use some of these games in which people exert themselves as a way of instilling healthier behaviors, to nudge people towards healthier outcomes based on these virtual experiences. So there's an ongoing interest in how we can use video games as a way of, perhaps paradoxically, because many of us may not think of gamers as active people, to use video games to actually nudge people to become more active. What we did here is a study that had two samples. One, the first sample was an all-female sample, and the second study is a replication of this first study with an all-male sample. If you were a participant in one of my experiments, what would happen is that in the first experiment, it was an all-female sample. Our participants were randomly assigned to a self-avatar that could be thin or obese, and they played against a virtual opponent, not a real person, but they would see on screen a virtual opponent that could also be obese or it could be thin. All characteristics were actually very much the same between the avatars. Now, I was not necessarily interested in people self-reporting about their physical activity while playing the game. I was actually interested in measuring their behaviors. So we furnished our participants with accelerometers, both in their wrist and one accelerometer in their waist, and they were asked to play this virtual tennis game. So you can imagine people flying around my laboratory while playing this virtual game with the Nintendo Wii console while using accelerometers. That was basically the setup of the study. And I was very pleased to find that indeed the virtual body that our participants were randomly assigned to affected their behaviors out there in the real world. For example, our female participants showed increased physical activity in their waist the more when they had thin avatars that were randomly assigned to them in comparison to when they were actually using obese avatars. Some literature would imply that when we compete with other people, we compare ourselves to others. We size up our opponents and figure out whether you have the characteristics for you to be able to beat them or whether you are going to get beaten yourself because you don't have the skills. We found some interesting social comparison effects in this particular context, and these effects were as follow. They were pretty consistent. The one thing that I want to highlight about this graph is in connection to wrist activity while playing the virtual tennis game and waist activity while playing the virtual tennis game. Overall, our participants had a slim self-avatar that were playing against a slim opponent, showed the most increased physical activity in comparison to some of the remaining conditions. So indeed, people would compare themselves in relation to their opponent. Perception indeed affects behavior. Would these results replicate in an all-male sample? This is not an outlandish question because there's some research out there that would imply that exposure to body-related images would have stronger effects on female participants in comparison to male participants. So one prediction would be that the results might not replicate in an all-male sample. What we did here is the same idea. We invited the same number of participants to our laboratory, and we had male avatars that would be slim or a more obese avatar that to me looks a little bit more like Jay Leno, but that's beside the point. We also measured participants' physical activity as they were playing the game, and I'm very happy to results that the results indeed replicated with a little bit of a difference. It should say wrist activity right there. Our participants that were male actually showed increased wrist activity while playing the virtual tennis game when they were thin in the virtual environment in comparison to when they were obese. Some of you might be wondering, well, but what happened with participants that you had that were thinner or obese? Would that actually modify the effect? Surprisingly, people's own body size index, their own body mass index, did not have an effect on the results. The effect operated regardless of our participants' own BMI. I think that the explanation for that might be that when we are in a virtual environment, we might get so immersed in the moment that we might forget about our physical bodies and get projected our minds to the screen. That being said, our male participants showed something very interesting too, supporting the idea that perception affects reality. For example, I run a statistical moderation model where I ask our participants to compare their own virtual body size to the body size of their opponent, and physical activity was significantly reduced the more that the participants thought that their self-avatar was more obese than their virtual opponents. When the participants saw themselves at a disadvantage, they show decreased physical activity. I think, as I said, that this is a good demonstration of how perception affects behavior, how perception affects reality. Where are we going with this in the near future? I always tell my students, don't talk about half-cooked studies in a presentation. I'm going to go against my own advice and present you some of the ideas that we have, that we are entertaining in the laboratory right now. For example, one of our communication grad students, Mang Cheng, is very interested in applying Amy Cuddy's research, which we will hear some more about later today in the context of motion-controlled games. If you're playing the Nintendo Wii and you're playing with a powerful pose or a powerless pose, would that affect your experience and subsequent behaviors? What if you play this video game standing up or sitting down? And here you can see the pictures of what the intended manipulations are going to be. The outcome measures that we are entertaining for this study are as follows. For example, we are of course interested in whether this experience of playing motion games using different powerful or powerless poses would affect people's self-perception, but we're also interested in research that would show that striking a power pose might get people to become more akin to taking risks. But we're also interested, because we care about virtual experience, of whether people had a more joyful time while playing the game, or whether they actually got more immersed in the game. The final study that we are carrying out right now is asking what happens when people play games like, for example, Minecraft. Anybody here has heard of Minecraft? If you had kids, you have, yeah, many of you. Okay, so we ask our participants to either renovate or demolish this building in Minecraft. Then we ask our participants to either play the game or actually watch a recorded version of someone else playing the game. And then the experimenter would come over and say, hey, we have an experimental session that's coming up. Could you please sharpen some pencils for me? And then we would have our participants in two conditions. One with an electric sharpener, which is very easy for you to perform the favor, and a manual sharpener that is actually quite hard. It sounds like a trivial question, but many of the studies that have looked at whether video games affect pro-social behavior have not really looked at how easy or how difficult it is to perform that particular behavior. Right now, we're analyzing the data. I'm happy to report that indeed we have the behavioral effect in terms of the easiness or difficulty of playing of performing the favor, and at the same time that people were more likely to sign up to a community renovation Facebook page the more that they renovated the building on Minecraft in comparison to destroying the building on Minecraft. Just some closing remarks. I would like to invite you to think of video games as a social laboratory. It's a social laboratory in which we can perhaps apply some of our theories, some of our principles, some of our methods as a way of modeling people towards healthier behaviors, as implied in some of the exercise game studies that I presented today. I would like also to highlight how video games can aid in terms of experimental control. You can actually program the game for people to have the same experience at the same time and experience the same actions in that particular environment. So experimental control, we care for it, and I think that studies in virtual environments and video games can provide us with increased control in certain contexts. And then finally, replication. Replication is important for social scientists, and I have all of the files for my studies. I can send them to researchers anywhere around the world for them to replicate these studies anywhere with a different sample. And if you're interested in replicating some of these studies in your own laboratory, please let me know. I hope that this presentation today showed that virtual experiences perhaps matter, and that there's a promise that we can use games and virtual environments as a way of leveraging the technology for pro-social outcomes. Thank you.